Those of you who regrettably listen to self-styled experts online have been exposed to the argument that empaths is just another name for what is known in clinical jargon as highly sensitive people, or HSPs. In other words, empath equals HSP. But since this information is emanating from self-styled experts, as usual, it is misinformation. No, empaths are not HSPs, and HSPs are not empaths. And the main reason for this is that there's no such thing as empath. Okay, Shoshadim, but today we are going to delve deep into sensitive people, also known as highly sensitive persons, HSPs. My name is Sam Vaknin. I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited. I'm also a professor of psychology, and today I'm going to review an article published recently entitled The Relationship Between Environmental Sensitivity and Common Mental Health Problems in Adolescents and Adults, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. It was published in Clinical Psychological Science not long ago, as I said. Let's start with some basic facts. It is estimated that anywhere between 1/5 and 1/3 of the population are highly sensitive. They are highly sensitive persons, HSPs. Now, people who are less versed with clinical psychology and its vicissitudes, they would say that there's no such thing as highly sensitive person. These are drama queens, or they are thin-skinned, or they can't take criticism, or maybe even they're narcissists. But it seems that HSPs, highly sensitive persons, is a clinical construct that has some validity. These people may be wired differently as far as their brains go. So this article that I've referred to earlier involved 12,000 people. It's actually a meta-analysis. It put together previous studies. And the experts who meta-analyzed these studies found that persons with high sensitivity were more likely to experience mental health issues, including anxiety and depression. In other words, if you're highly sensitive, you're more likely to be anxious or depressed than if you're not sensitive, like me. Now, this is not as trivial as it sounds. It's not as trivial because the dimension of sensitivity has been much neglected both in literature and in psychological testing, let alone in treatment. So it is a breakthrough article or breakthrough meta-analysis because it places the dimension or the trait of sensitivity firmly on the table. Tom Falkenstein, a psychotherapist at Queen Mary University in London, co-authored the study. And this is what he had to say. We found positive and moderate correlations between sensitivity and various mental health problems, such as depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, agoraphobia, and avoidant personality disorder. Our findings, said Falkenstein, our findings suggest that sensitivity should be considered more in clinical practice, which could be used to improve diagnosis of conditions. In addition, our findings could help improve treatment for these individuals. Highly sensitive persons, concludes the co-author, are more likely to respond better to some psychological interventions than less sensitive individuals. Therefore, sensitivity should be considered when thinking about treatment plans for mental health conditions. But what are we talking about? What is a highly sensitive person? The widely accepted definition is it is someone with an increased central nervous system sensitivity to physical, emotional, and social stimuli. No empathy mentioned. Hence, no empaths. Empaths out. Okay, the term highly sensitive person was coined in the mid-1990s by psychologist Elaine Aron, A-R-O-N, and she published a book titled The Highly Sensitive Person. Mind you, she was not the first to suggest this. Jung was actually the first. We'll come to it a bit later. This part of the video is for laymen, and then I'm going to go deep diving into the clinical literature, and that would be a part for clinicians. Anyhow, Aaron theorized that highly sensitive persons have a hyper-evolved sense of danger. In other words, hypervigilance. And she postulated that this is the result of inherited genes. In other words, she suggested in a roundabout way that sensitivity was a trait, because we know that human traits are hereditary. And so she said its genes are involved, and these people can read other human emotions to an extraordinary degree. They don't experience these emotions, but they can read other people. This is very reminiscent, actually, of the narcissists and the psychopaths called empathy. Aaron did not say that there is any emotional response to this reading of other people's emotions. In other words, Aaron did not involve empathy in the presentation of highly sensitive persons, only the ability to decode and decipher and read other people. But this is also true of narcissists and psychopaths, of course. Later research suggested that highly sensitive persons have probably higher levels of neurotransmitters such as dopamine, and this contributes to a heightened responsiveness to stimuli. There were other studies, and these studies cited childhood trauma, adverse childhood experiences as potential causes. This is the eternal battle zone, eternal conflict and debate between nature and nurture. And so, in this new research, the article that I would be analyzing in this video, the scientists or the scholars amalgamated 33 studies involving, as I said, almost 13,000 people, anywhere between 12 years of age and 89 years of age. They found that highly sensitive persons were more likely to suffer depression and anxiety, but this was only part of the picture. They said that sensitivity is significantly correlated with common mental health outcomes, and they paid attention to specific disorders. One of the paragraphs in the article says, it is also noticeable that we found moderate and positive correlations with agoraphobia, an avoidant personality disorder. It is noticeable, it is interesting, because one explanation for the higher likelihood of highly sensitive persons experiencing anxiety may be what the authors called the depth of processing, or their tendency to respond with overstimulation. Depth of processing, says the article, might reflect a tendency to worry about future outcomes, catastrophizing, or could lead to imagining possible future scenarios in a given situation that could account for some anxiety. Again, they're describing catastrophizing. Depression, on the other hand, might be more dependent on the environmental factors. What emerges from this study is that hypervigilance and catastrophizing, which are common causes of anxiety, and if anxiety persists, common causes of depression, they are associated with high sensitivity. Professor Michael Pluis, an expert in developmental psychology at the University of Surrey and Queen Mary University of London, and one of the co-authors of the study, added this: it is important to remember that highly sensitive people are also more responsive to positive experiences, not only negative ones, including psychological treatment. Our results provide further evidence that sensitive people are more affected by both negative and positive experiences, and that the quality of their environment is particularly important for their well-being. It's a limited study in many ways. The average age of the people in the study was 25. There is a question as to the trajectory of the sensitivity trait throughout the lifespan. Are we more sensitive when we are young and much less sensitive, much more jaded when we are older? We don't know the answer to this. And most of the participants were highly educated young women, which by common stereotype are prone to be more sensitive than men, or at least to display more sensitivity than men. And so there was an overrepresentation of women. And even the authors admit that this makes it difficult to predict whether the correlations observed could apply to a more diverse population. Heightened sensitivity can also be the consequence of mental health problems rather than the cause. In other words, it's difficult to establish the arrow of causation. Which is the chicken and which is the egg? What has led to what? If you're born highly sensitive, if your sensitivity trait is very vulnerable, highly overstimulated, you may develop mental illness. On the other hand, perhaps you're born with some kind of mental illness, or you develop mental illness owing to life's egregious circumstances, and then you become sensitized, you become sensitive. We don't know which leads to which, to be honest. So all the studies in this meta-analysis relied on self-reporting. People reported their feelings. That is always a seriously bad idea, as we can't trust self-reporting. It's nothing near a randomized trial. People are influenced by specific personalities and by specific composition or constitution and internal psychological processes and other traits. So, for example, if you're highly introspective, if you constantly engage in soul searching, you may develop sensitivity. Or if you're a people pleaser, attuned to the needs of other people all the time, if you're codependent, there is a question here as to whether sensitivity is a primary trait which predisposes to certain behaviors and mental constitutions and mental illness, or whether it is the outcome, a derivative trait, the outcome, or whether even it's triggered. In other words, it's there, it's dormant and triggered. We have no clue. We don't know to answer these questions. The number of people seeking help for mental illness has risen by 40% since the pandemic. At any given moment, in the United States alone, there are 4 million people in treatment for mental illnesses. And the latest figures from the Office of National Statistics show that almost 1/4 of children, I'm sorry, that's in England, not in the United States, in England. And so the latest figures from the Office of National Statistics show that almost 1/4 of children in England now have probable mental disorder, up from 20% in the previous year. And so if we can ascertain, if we can establish that environmental sensitivity is a personality trait, that it reflects individual differences in response to environmental influences and stimuli and cues, if we can establish this, then we will have stumbled upon another dimension which predisposes either to mental health or to mental illness. Although the link between common personality traits and psychopathology is well established, the trait of sensitivity has been overlooked. Shockingly, if I may say, because, mentally ill people strike casual observers and laymen as highly sensitive or oversensitive. And yet this has been completely ignored in both clinical practice, in scholarly literature. There is a robust association between sensitivity and mental health. And this has been established actually in several studies. The relationship between big 5 personality traits and psychopathology is now indisputable. We have studies that demonstrate consistently, conclusively, and convincingly that higher levels of neuroticism are associated with poorer mental health outcomes, including greater levels and incidence of depression and anxiety and psychological distress. Another personality trait that is associated with increased risk of mental health issues is, as I said, sensitivity. The trait sensitivity, also referred in the literature as sensory processing sensitivity, SPS. Again, Aaron made major contributions to this. So the trait of sensitivity is a form of heightened degree of responsiveness to physical, emotional, and social stimuli. It could be anything from bright lights, subtle changes in the environment, other people's moods, and there is deeper cognitive processing of such sensory stimulation. It's as if the apparatus, the mental machinery is overwhelmed, and there's a need to cognitively process things in order to avoid a total meltdown or total collapse. Sensitivity is also associated with other established personality traits such as neuroticism, introversion, and openness to experiences, although we should not confuse these. Sensitivity is not any of these things. I refer you to studies by Leonetti, Plus, and others. So, we need to conceptualize sensitivity as a trait. And this is nothing new. This is not Aaron's work. That is actually Carl Jung's work. The Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst proposed as early as 1913, more than 115 years, 110 years ago. He proposed that there is something he called innate sensitiveness. And this has become the focus of empirical research starting in the mid-1990s. The reason for this delay is that psychoanalysis in general has been disparaged and mocked and ridiculed and became an outcast. Regrettably, one of the most stupid moves in modern psychology. But okay, Jung pointed out that there is what he called innate sensitiveness in people, and that some people have higher innate sensitiveness and others have lower innate sensitiveness. In this sense, it's a spectrum that is very reminiscent of all other traits we know of, including, for example, narcissism. It has been shown that individual differences in registering, processing, and responding to environmental stimuli exist in many species, not only human beings. We have studies by Belsky, Ellis, many others. And these differences must be neurobiological. It's very unlikely that they emerge out of some kind of early childhood conditioning or early childhood trauma or abuse. In this particular case, I'm a proponent of the hereditary genetic model. These differences in sensitivity are associated with genetic and prenatal and postnatal environmental factors and are driven by a more sensitive central nervous system. It's not only Aaron that says this. Griven says this. Wolf says this. There are at least 3 theoretical frameworks that have been since developed to try to attempt to describe or capture individual differences in sensitivity. So the first model is known as differential susceptibility. It's the model developed by Belsky and Plus. The second model is biological sensitivity to context, developed by Boyce and Ellis. And then there is the most famous model, sensory processing sensitivity, which is Aaron's model. There are differences between these frameworks, but they all share the notion that individual differences in sensitivity exist for evolutionary reasons, and that sensitive individuals are both more vulnerable to the negative effects of adversity, but they also benefit more from positive, supportive experiences. They are overreactive to both positive and negative stimuli or inputs. And so there was an attempt to integrate these different sensitivity concepts into a single overarching meta-framework. Plus attempted it in 2015, and he introduced the umbrella term environmental sensitivity, ES, which has been adopted increasingly in recent years to describe sensitivity as a concept and as a trait. Sensitive people with sensitivity, heightened sensitivity, generally fall into three distinct groups along a sensitivity continuum. There are people with low sensitivity. It's about 1/3 of a population. People with medium sensitivity, which is the majority of us, about 40% of a population, and highly sensitive people, 31% of a population. That is work conducted by Leonetti. There was one twin study, a series in 2020, and there were several functional MRI studies, Acevedo, Aaron, Jagielowicz, and others. And all of them support the biological basis of the traits. They show that sensitivity is moderately heritable and marked by higher activation in brain regions that are involved in empathy, social processing, and reflective thinking. Now, this activation in these brain areas do not imply that these people are hyper-empathic, hyper-social, capable of a heightened level of thinking. That's not what these models and theories and studies show. That's why highly sensitive people are not empaths, whatever that may mean. It simply shows that these regions in the brain react more powerfully to environmental stimuli than in normal people. The innate experience, the inner experience of highly sensitive persons is not that of heightened empathy, for example, but hyperreactivity to cues and stimuli and inputs, including verbal inputs, from other people. The reaction is not to some internal landscape of the other person, but to what the other person is doing. Empathy is when you interact with the internal processes, the internal landscape, the mind, the feelings of another person. The interaction is imaginary, of course. It's constructed on a theory of mind. It emanates from a theory of mind. It's a process of mentalization. But empathy is about what goes on in the mind of another person. Whereas highly sensitive persons, hypersensitivity, is about what other people do, what other people say, and the reaction, the hypersensitive reaction, is to these external observables. Similarly, when we say social processing, when we say that highly sensitive persons are, the social processing of highly sensitive person is enhanced, elevated, the brain regions of highly sensitive persons which deal with social processing light up or fire up, it doesn't mean that these people are more social or more sociable or react to social cues more than others. That's not what it means. It means that when they find themselves in social situations, their brains overreact. Okay? It's a very critical distinction. It's not about the inside. It's about the outside. It's a reaction to the outside. And it's a reaction to surface phenomena. It's a reaction to what is observable by other people as well. It's a reaction to what other people say, what other people do, how many people are in the room, whether it's a social gathering, and so on and so forth. According to Aaron, sensitivity is indicated by heightened sensory sensitivity. The emphasis is on sensory inputs, not on empathy, not on any psychological process. It's simply a heightened reaction, hyperreactivity, overstimulation, owing to sensory inputs that come from the environment. There's a proneness, if you wish, to hyperarousal. There's an emotional reactivity. There's a depth of processing. And all these can be measured. There's scales and tests that we can administer, and they tell us where people are on the sensitivity scale. And so, initially in 1997, Aaron proposed that sensitivity is a unidimensional thing, but later studies found that there are multiple dimensions in sensitivity. For example, Smolevska identified a three-factor structure involving the following. Number one, ease of excitation, which refers to being easily overwhelmed by internal or external stimuli. Very reminiscent of emotional dysregulation in borderline personality disorder. And so one of the typical questions in the scale is, are you more than others affected by the moods of other people? Then, second dimension, low sensory threshold, which refers to unpleasant sensory arousal from external stimuli. Do you become unpleasantly aroused when a lot is going on around you? And that is very reminiscent of autism. And C, aesthetic sensitivity, which refers to being susceptible to beauty and the arts. Are you deeply moved by the arts, music, films, and so on? You're beginning to see that highly sensitive persons may be a hybrid or a mongrel construct. Actually, if we were to remove people with autism spectrum disorder, if we were to remove people with borderline personality disorder, nothing much will be left. I'm proposing that highly sensitive persons is just another name for people with highly specific mental health problems and disorders, such as borderline personality disorder, such as autism spectrum disorder, and such as narcissistic personality disorder. I think if you put all these disorders together, what you get is highly sensitive persons. Of course, there are highly sensitive persons who are not mentally ill, highly sensitive persons without a personality disorder. There are such people. Their brains are built in a way, constructed in a way that they overreact to any stimulus from the outside. In recent years, what is emerging is a bifactor structure, which has been confirmed in studies. There's an overarching sensory sensitivity factor, and there are three subscales that capture the multidimensionality that I mentioned before with Smolevska's work. Over the last 25 years, there's a growing number of studies, and there is one systematic review, Costa Lopez, 2021, and they've investigated the relationship between sensitivity and mental health in adolescents and adults. And these studies provided what I regard as incontrovertible evidence of a consistent association between high levels of sensitivity and a wide range of symptoms of psychopathology and psychological issues. Anxiety and depression, Baker and Moulding, Liss, and other studies. Difficulties in emotional regulation, Brindle. Low levels of subjective happiness, Soboko, Zelensky, not that Zelensky. Lower levels of life satisfaction, Booth. Increased levels of stress, Baker and Moulding. Physical symptoms of ill health, Benham. Burnout, Golonka and Gala. Greater dissatisfaction at work and a greater need for recovery, Andresen, Evers, and others. You see that high sensitivity predisposes people to malfunction or to dysfunction. It reduces self-efficacy and affects functioning in a variety of areas of life. In this sense, high sensitivity may not only be a trait, but a predisposing psychogenic factor, a factor predisposing for psychopathology, pathogenic factor, in effect. Now, there are several explanations offered about the underlying mechanisms that drive this detected association between sensitivity and mental health issues. So Benham and Brindle suggested that individuals with high levels of sensitivity suffer from poorer mental health than individuals low in sensitivity because of their tendency to feel more easily overstimulated and maybe overwhelmed by internal and external stimuli. More specifically, when you feel often, when the experience with sensations and feelings is very frequent, and when you are quickly overwhelmed in everyday life because of perceiving more stressors, this renders you vulnerable. This renders you brittle. It promotes a recurring sense of learned helplessness in the individual, a mental state that contributes to depression and anxiety, as Jano had observed. Other scholars propose that the association between sensitivity and mental health issues is driven by the depth of processing, which refers to deeper cognitive processing of stimuli, which is unusual. For example, Leonetti identified rumination as an important cognitive risk factor for the development of depressive symptoms in highly sensitive children, suggested that it is exactly this depth of processing that could facilitate rumination and the internalization of problems. Another possible explanation for this mysterious association between sensitivity and mental illness is negative affects or negative affectivity. Sensitivity, it seems, predisposes you to having negative affects, such as, for example, fear or anger or envy. And so this gives rise, inevitably, to depression. Brindle was the first to make this link. Brindle focused on emotional reactivity, the tendency of highly sensitive individuals to react strongly with both positive and negative feelings. And yet it seems that the more exposed you are to stimuli, the more overwhelmed you are by stimuli, the more you drown yourself and get immersed in an endless stream of cues, inputs, information, stimuli, and so on and so forth, the more likely you are to become defensive because your vulnerability increases. And this is the cornerstone of negative affects, not positive ones. Brindle hypothesized that individuals high in sensitivity are more aware of their negative emotional states, while also showing lower self-efficacy regarding how they might change their negative emotional states. In other words, when you are more aware, when there's increased awareness of negative emotional states, when you're more aware of your negative emotional states, you're more aware that you're angry, that you are hateful, that you are rageful, that you are envious, that you are fearful, anxious, you're more aware of all these. And you don't have the emotional regulation skills to overcome these, which again, reminiscent a lot of a borderline personality organization. This causes recurrent feelings of helplessness and negative effects in the individual. Theories of sensitivity postulate that highly sensitive individuals are not only more affected by adversity, but also benefit disproportionately from supportive experiences and environments, as I mentioned earlier. But in truth, most studies support the former. Most studies tend to show that hypersensitivity, heightened sensitivity, would ineluctably and inexorably lead the individual to a negative territory, where these kind of individuals experience negative emotions much more profoundly and much more intensely than positive ones. Although in theory, they should be open to both types of experiences and be hyperreactive to both, I don't think there's sufficient evidence for this. It has been shown that individuals with high levels of sensitivity benefit from psychological interventions. But I don't know if behavior modification or getting rid of behavioral problems in school settings using therapy would be construed a positive experience by the children themselves. I doubt it. It has been shown that high levels of sensitivity correlate with positive outcomes, an increase in positive affect following positive mood induction, and more positive responses to anti-bullying and depression prevention programs in children and adolescents. So all these studies, Leonetti, Nocentini, Boniwell, all these studies are in school settings, all of them involve children, and all of them involve interventions, mainly therapy. Why this is considered a positive experience that induces positive effects is beyond me. It's a great mystery. Anyhow, in the study, in the article, the study that I'm analyzing, what they did, they aggregated, it's called meta-analysis. They aggregated 33 studies. And they revealed positive and moderate correlations between sensitivity and various mental health outcomes, such as depression, anxiety, psychosomatic symptoms, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, agoraphobia, social phobia, and avoidant personality disorder. There's a moderate and significant association mainly for depression and anxiety. Sensitivity correlates with many different common mental health problems beyond depression and anxiety, but the strongest link involves depression and anxiety. And so, could we use sensitivity as a predictor, prognosticator, or diagnostic marker? That's still an open question because, as I said, there's a chicken and egg situation. We are not quite sure what leads to what and why. Based on the findings in the article, the sensitivity framework seems to be in line with a broad approach to etiology, conceptualization, and treatment. And this is because the authors advocate for opening up the diagnostic categories and diagnostic specific interventions. They say that sensitivity correlates with many different mental health problems, should not be confined to the diagnosis or the treatment of depression and anxiety. It seems feasible, say the authors, and I'm quoting, that individuals, irrelevant of their diagnosis, who score high on sensitivity may especially benefit from treatment plans focusing on strengthening emotional regulation skills, applied relaxation, mindfulness, and so on. In turn, individuals with high levels of apathy might respond particularly well to the positive effects of arts, music, and nature. Considering the comorbidity of diagnoses and the heterogeneity of clinical presentations in clinical contexts, sensitivity appears to represent a promising transdiagnostic risk factor, a predisposition. The strength of the overall effect size was similar for anxiety and depression, but the association between sensitivity and anxiety shows a greater homogeneity. I think that future scholars would do well to consider this as a trajectory or a path. There's hypersensitivity or high sensitivity, which leads to hypervigilance and catastrophizing, which lead to anxiety, which leads to depression, and together this confluence results in mental health issues such as borderline personality disorder and others, where emotional dysregulation or emotion dysregulation is a major clinical feature. The authors continue to say, one possible explanation for this, for the fact that there's homogeneity in the association between sensitivity and anxiety, one possible explanation for this could be that core aspects of sensitivity, such as depth of processing or the tendency to respond with overstimulation, are more similar or overlap with symptoms of anxiety rather than symptoms of depression, regardless of environmental influences. For example, feeling physically and emotionally aroused because of overstimulation is likely experienced as feeling anxious, or could lead to feelings of anxiety and subsequent avoidance of certain situations. Depth of processing might reflect a tendency to worry about future outcomes, catastrophizing, or could lead to imagining possible future scenarios in a given situation that could account for some anxiety. Depression, on the other hand, might be more dependent on the environmental factors and the quality thereof. For example, the authors give some examples. Some studies have shown lower levels of depression in highly sensitive individuals who have grown up in supportive and positive environments, but higher levels of depression in highly sensitive individuals who have grown up in adverse, emotionally unsupportive environments. That is a study by Slagt, S-L-A-G-T. And so the likely variability, I'm continuing to quote the article, hence the likely variability in environmental quality between individuals and samples might account for greater heterogeneity in the association between sensitivity and depression. All the suggestions for the reasons why sensitivity correlates with mental health outcomes focus not on the global trait as such, but on specific aspects of the trait, such as depth of processing, emotional reactivity, and overstimulation. Looking beyond the correlation with depression and anxiety, it is noticeable that we found moderate and positive correlations with agoraphobia and avoidant personality disorders in 3 studies. Hoffman and Bittran, Meyer and Carver, nil. These correlations, in addition to the moderate correlation with social introversion found in a previous study by Aaron, invite the question of whether agoraphobic withdrawal and avoidance could be interpreted as maladaptive coping strategies in response to overstimulation and emotional reactivity, strategies that are particularly common in individuals with high levels of sensitivity. So that's the overview. Sensitivity seems to be present in a variety of mental health issues. However, we have no idea whether the sensitivity caused these mental health issues or vice versa. And at any rate, the authors are right that the same way we use other traits to diagnose, to prognosticate, to predict, to treat, we should begin to use sensitivity, because sensitivity clearly is a predisposing factor, and possibly, as future studies might show, a factor of personality as well.